Hello and welcome to our next session of intercultural communication. The course code is JMC 201. It's our lecture number 17, which is what causes biases against outgroups. We'll be talking about perceptions and selective attention. So, welcome to the session. I'm Parvez Khan. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Journalism and Mass Communication, Cohort University of Science and Technology. So today we'll be talking about biases, what causes the biases against outgroups. But before we start our session, we'll be talking about the objectives of the session first. Students will be able to understand what causes bias against the groups. Students will be able to understand how ethnocentrism leads towards bias. We'll be discussing different perspectives from us versus them or the outgroup versus the in-group debate. So this is what we are going to discuss. Altogether, the purpose of this session is to understand what are the leading factors that causes bias for the outgroups. How do we think of others when we think about them? Is there a stereotypical image? Is there ethnocentrism involved? Is there a selection? Is a selective process or selective interpretation? So this is what we are going to look into. So you can see it in the image that clearly defines the out-group versus in-group. It's just to give you an example of how things look when people are together and someone is excluded. Individual groups when the people they gather and they just exclude the others. This is what we call the out-group versus in-group. This was just to give you an example that how similar minds they come together and they exclude others who are different from them. So this is the purpose of our session in intercultural communication, to understand the concept of perception. Now, it's important to understand that what is perception, how we perceive things, how we look at things. What is our perception about others? What is our perception about refugees? What's our perception about Muslims? What is our perceptions of Christians? That perceptions matter a lot when they're living in a different country. For example, if Muslims are going to go to a country which is a non-Muslim country, so what the non-Muslims think about Muslims, that's important, how they perceive them. Similarly, if there are refugees in our countries, how we look at them, that's important, how we have a perception about them. So we have defined them, we have categorized them, and this is what happens because when you're in the minority, when you are different from the majority, there's a particular perception about you. And that perception can be based on stereotypical images or ethnocentric notions, but it's there. So, what is perception? Human perception is the process of selecting cues quickly from the environment, organizing them into a coherent pattern, and labeling such a pattern, and interpreting that pattern in accordance to our expectation. Well, perception is obviously towards the end, we have highlighted, very important point is that the pattern in accordance to our expectation, how we perceive them, is basically the perception. And the human perception is basically the process of selecting cues from the environment. And perception is typically a quick three-step process of selective attention, selective organization, and selective interpretation. And each of these steps is heavily affected by our cultural conditioning process. Now, perception is not just a simple thing that how we perceive things about others. It's a selective attention, it's selective organization, and it is selective interpretation. The key word here is selective because we choose it. We have the authority to define our perception. It's us deciding them. So this is why the word selective means a lot over here, and I would like to emphasize to think about this word. And that's why I have written it selective attention, selective organization, and selective interpretation. This is the key point to understand, and this is how we'll take our session a bit further. And an example of this one, that in a university restaurant, a black woman was having lunch with her colleagues, and suddenly she saw a table which was next to her. It was decorated, so she went there and asked them, I was wondering what the special occasion was. And one woman who was sitting over there, she smiled and replied that we are celebrating Friendship Day. We do this every year. And by the way, if you don't mind, may I have a glass of iced tea? No cubes, please. And she was totally stunned. And she said that I'm sorry, I did not introduce myself. I am an assistant dean in the College of Arts and Sciences. Now, what is important here is that black woman, she goes there to a table and she asks them what is so special, and it looks like a great event, and she responds that we are celebrating our friendship day, and if you don't mind, can you bring me a glass of iced tea? Basically, a white woman apologized and ended with, I thought you were the maitre d', I mean the head maitre. So she thought that she was a waitress or someone in the restaurant who was supposed to take orders just because of her skin color. This is a classic example. Now, let me rephrase all of this example in just simple words in case you're not getting it. Is that a black woman who is sitting in a university restaurant, she goes and asks someone in the next table that why are they celebrating, and it seems a very special occasion. She wanted to know more about it, but the person over there responded that they are enjoying their friendship day, but if you can bring some iced tea. The white woman thought that this black lady, since she's black, she must be a waiter, she must be working in the restaurant. Now, this is a very classic example of how we perceive things. Now, without asking her that, do you work here or are you from the restaurant, she assumed that since she is black, she must be a waitress, she must be someone working here, and this is how we come across racism and stereotypings and ethnocentrism because of the perception we have. Like people assume things in their minds, in the mental modes, that she must be someone from the restaurant, she's a waitress, she must be the head waitress, or something like that. So that's crucial in understanding racism that takes place, because racism is selective process. We humans have an ability of doing this in each and every way. We just don't know about it. Sometimes we are privileged enough to ignore it, but somehow we all do it in these capacities. And the purpose of this session, this class, is to reduce our biases towards the outgroup. If someone is not what you are, the group you belong to, it doesn't mean that they do not have the right to a dignified life, or you do not have the right to label them. You do not have the right to stereotype them. This is what the purpose of this session is. Now let's talk about selective attention. Selective attention process, we pick out cues. In selection attention process, we pick out cues quickly from a cultural landscape. The cultural landscape is there, we pick it from there. And in unfamiliar environment, we tend to pay closer attention to the cues that match our own salient identities, what the same age group, and cues that are distinctive from the group, like different skin color. So even if you are in a different environment, what you look at is like some same age group or same skin color, and cues that serve our interaction, expectation, or goals, like shaking hands, greeting rituals, because it is important to pick up every detail or stimulus that we receive in an overloaded environment. We thus selectively choose from the incoming data. Now, this is very important. Like selective attention, we give selective attention to the processes that are taking place. We look at the, even in an unfamiliar environment, we pay closer attention to the cues that match our own identities, like same age group. If we go to a place where we find, now a good example of this would be like if Pakistan and people from India, they happen to meet in America or Australia, because of their skin colors, they would, and the language that they have in common, they would go out and just greet each other. Hi, hello. Are you from Asia, or are you from Pakistan, or are you from India or Maldives or somewhere else? That's what brings them closer. You look for that. You look for selective attention. But when someone is an outgroup, for example, if someone's skin color is different from you, for example, if you're black and you'll be looking for black, but if there's white people, you would look at it from a different perspective. So now that also brings in a lot of privilege, but we'll explain this all text in the example that we just shared in the beginning, the restaurant example. That selective attention principle can explain part of this opening story. The white woman was quickly drawn to the distinctive feature, like moment white woman saw, she just saw the skin color of the assistant dean Pauline, and her selective attention to skin color also paid, paired quickly with the expected identity role of Assistant Dean Pauline in that university restaurant setting. Now, in other words, the white female diner quickly formed a stereotypical cognitive map concerning an African female's role in the restaurant setting. Now, this is what we talked about. The moment the white woman saw the black woman in a restaurant, she assumed the stereotypical image of a black woman working in a restaurant. Now, this is the selective attention principle that the moment you see, without analyzing, without thinking, you just selected her as someone who will be working there. Now, the second step in our perception is selective organization. Like the second step in the process is the selective organization and labeling process. This is where you label a person. Our culture and the language we speak guide us to the aspects of our environment that we consider relevant. And we have learned from our cultural, ethnic, and socialization to organize our perception by grouping similar objects, people, or things together and labeling them with a symbol or name. So, this means that concurrently we are organizing objects, peoples, or things into the other category with a label. We have otherized them, we have made them different. So, the moment you see a black person, since a black is not white, so you have put them in the other category and you have labeled them as someone else. So, how you choose to organize your perception and name your perception depends on your own identities, values, attitudes, language labels, and the context. This is what defines it. All these things matter when you label another person from another group or the outsiders group. It all depends on your own identity. For example, if you're white, your identity is white, your values are different, your attitude is different, your language is different. So that automatically gives a context that she is someone else, she is the out group, and you just label her as a waiter. Now, the example here is that let's return to the opening story that the white woman who incorrectly classified Assistant Dean Pauline as the maitre d' or the head maitre was probably using a two category language system in her mindset: dinner guests and servers. She was thinking about everyone as guests and servers. That's how she categorized it. And she thought in her mind that Assistant Dean Pauline as a prototype of black female restaurant waitress. This is what he thought, that obviously, since we are dining, since she's standing, she's a waitress. Now, despite her apology, they actually further reflected her unconscious perpetual bias in action. This is the very, very important point. That even though she apologized that I'm sorry, I didn't know that you're a waitress, but it explains the unconscious bias we have in our minds. Unconsciously, we say these things, and unconsciously, it creates a perpetual bias in action. So, the third one, the final one, is the selective interpretation. Obviously, this is how you interpret things. The last step in human perception is selective interpretation, how you interpret. And interpretation allows us to attach meanings to the data we receive, and this includes our expectations. So, we attach meanings to the data we receive, and it includes our expectations. Expectations involve what we anticipate and predict about how others will communicate with us during an interaction. We have pre-expectations and how this will go, and we try to anticipate. Anticipate is something that we guess in advance that how people will respond, and expectations are the filters of our perception of others. We have an image of how we expect people to behave in a given situation in accordance to our own identity role and our own perceived identity role of others. So this is very important, the interpretation process, but it all depends on expectations, or the kind of expectations we have. So we kind of interpret things selectively as well. So this is called selective interpretation. Now again, the example that in the opening story, both the white female diner and Assistant Dean Pauline were caught off guard. Obviously, they were caught off guard. They didn't know how to respond to each other because it was an awkward circumstances. The white female diner perceived herself as a restaurant guest who was being approached by an African American waitress. Meanwhile, Assistant Dean Pauline perceived herself in the professional dean's role and was trying to be friendly and gracious in inquiring about the get together of the people and the beautifully decorated table. So both were caught by surprise when the intergroup interpersonal interaction script did not go as intended. This is a classic example when the interpersonal interaction did not go as intended. It didn't go as it should have gone. It created an awkward moment, it created uncertainty, and that's how it is. Now let's look at this picture. It's just to explain us versus them, how people perceive themselves in. This is not just. This is just a funny side of to look at things. That obviously the outgroups are considered different from you. So this was just one light one to look at it. But usually us, the group that we talk about, are people who consider themselves and their culture and their perceived norms to be perfect, whereas the culture of others, the outgroups, is something suspicious, and this is why racism and ethnocentrism and all kind of hate takes place. Now, conclusion in the discussions that these three perceptual filters, selective attention, selective organization, and selective interpretation, act as major barriers to the effective intercultural communication. Because you're giving selective attention to something, then you're giving selective organization and selective interpretation in accordance to the culture, the norms, the identity you have. So it means that you're not looking at things from their perspective. You're looking at it from your own perspective. It's always the us versus them perspective. And that works as a major barrier to the intercultural communication. Now, secondly, ineffective communication between cultural groups often happen because we assume that we perceive and interpret others' behavior in an objective and unbiased manner. We believe that the way we look at things, we are objective, we are unbiased. The way I am looking at things correctly. My lens is correct. The way, the vision I am looking at people is the only way, but it's wrong. People do look, and everything is subjective, and there are biased moments, and we need to reduce our biases. The reality, however, is that our perception of others are highly subjective, selective, and biased. We must never forget that we are always looking at things from subjective point of view. We are pretty much selective and it's biased. Now, the example of black women and white women is not the only example in the world. We can look into our cultures. We can look into what is happening to the distinctive cultures, the minorities around the world. We can look at different religious groups, how they are treated when they are in minorities. So it's a very good filter to understand it from selective attention, selective organization, and selective interpretation perspective. And we must never forget that reality, no matter what it is highly, our perceptions are highly subjective, selective, and biased. Now, before we end our session, let's talk more about our biases. Ethnocentrism. We we've discussed ethnocentrism, how it leads to when we believe that our culture, our way of life is superior to others. And because of ethnocentrism, we tend to define what goes on in our culture as natural and correct, and what goes on in other culture as unnatural and incorrect. Just we talked about it. We believe in our culture being superior to others, our beliefs being superior to others. And we tend to perceive in-group values, customs, norms, and roles as universally applicable. Every culture in the world believes that their way of life, their custom, their norms are the only way, but it's not the case. You find it out when you go out there, when you live amongst them, when you find distinctive culture. You believe that yes, people have similarities, but there are huge differences, and we can live with that. And then we tend to experience distance from the out group, especially when our group identity is threatened or under attack. That's another problem when the in group feels threatened by the out group. For example, the biggest example would be when black immigrants were making their way to the Europe, and particularly in UK. We saw a very good understanding of this event by Stuart Hall when he explained that the in group people in Britain, the white, they were threatened by the people coming and the immigration, and they accused them of having all the ills of society, like the mugging and the robberies taking place. They were accused of it because they blamed the immigration of the outgroups coming to their country, and they felt threatened. This is how it works, and it's just not the UK. It happens everywhere. When there's an outgroup living in your country, and if you feel threatened by them, then obviously uh, we experience distance from them, and when our identity is threatened. So this is us pretty much session for today. Some of the questions you can think about: what do you think about in-group versus out-group? Have you ever witnessed biased attitude from people outside your group? And then we have the references. We've used the book, very good discussion in this book about this topic, so you can read more about it. So this is pretty much it, and we discussed the process of selective attention, selective interpretation, and selective organization, how it leads towards the biases towards the outgroups. It's very important to understand this because perceptions can be biased. We can carry stereotypical images, particularly about the outgroups, and it's very important to understand them to reduce our own biases. So we'll continue with these kind of topics in the coming days as well. So I hope you enjoyed the session. Thank you very much. Stay in touch. Have a good day.